Today we'll be discussing an introduction to sociology. So what is sociology? Sociology is the study of groups and group interactions, societies and social interactions, from small and personal groups to very large groups and organizations. Sociology is a systematic or scientific study of human society and social behavior, from large-scale institutions and mass culture to small groups and individual interactions. So what does all this mean? Well, essentially, sociology is the study of society. Sociology can be best understood by studying what people do together. How do people survive? How do people interact? How do people begin to understand how to be productive members of society? What we want to understand is that neither an individual nor society can exist in isolation because as human beings, we're naturally social beings. Our survival is contingent on group membership, on developing a sense of self through our interactions with others. And throughout our everyday lives, we're going to interact with a wide variety of groups, from our neighborhood to our family, to our friends and peers at school and at work. All of these individuals shape our understanding of life and our understanding of sociology and social life. So as sociologists, we begin to study all aspects and levels of society. We start to think about society and we define it as a group of people who live together in a defined geographic area. People who interact with one another with some frequency, and individuals who share a common culture. As sociologists, we're concerned with micro-level analysis, individual interactions in small groups. We're interested in macro-level analysis, understanding trends that exist within society, understanding large organizations, large groups, and large societies. When we think about micro-level analysis within the field of sociology, we think about the impact of school uniform policies on social class relations at a school that's economically diverse. When we think about macro sociology, we can think about the impact of social media exposure on the self-esteem and the self-perception of middle school students in the Los Angeles Unified School District. We want to understand as sociologists how humans affect society and how society affects humans. It begins to paint a picture for us as to how we're going to approach sociological analysis later on, and also begins to shape our understanding of social research methods, which we'll discuss in the next chapter. We want to think about culture, and we're going to revisit culture later on, I believe in chapter 3. But just to quickly define what culture is. Culture refers to a group's shared practices and values and beliefs. Culture encompasses a group's way of life, from daily routines to everyday interactions to the most important parts of our group members' lives. Social interaction and culture play major roles in understanding our sense of self. Essentially, who are we today? Who are we going to be tomorrow? And who we're going to be 20 to 25 years from now? When you think of culture, I want you to think about the fact that we have something called the sociological imagination and the sociological perspective. The sociological imagination is essentially what is the relationship between our personal biographies and the history of society in understanding our sense of self and our role within society. We want to begin to understand how our individual circumstances are influenced by larger social forces. In other words, how are our personal troubles affected by larger social issues? And I want you to think, for example, about the issue of student debt. Oftentimes, people interpret student debt as a personal trouble. But in sociology, and through the adoption of sociological imagination, we actually look at it from a more critical analysis. Yes, it is a personal trouble to have mountains of school debt. But in reality, when we look at the larger social issue, it's the fact that we haven't, as a country, heavily invested in higher education. We provide the Pell Grant, but depending on what college or university you attend, the Pell Grant may not be adequate enough to cover even a significant percentage of the tuition. So students are oftentimes forced to take out massive amounts of loans in order to cover their studies, housing, food, etc. And this debt begins to grow and grow, especially with fluctuating interest rate at times of 5.5% to 6.5%. People begin to drown in debt. And although they're making payments, oftentimes they're only making payments to the interest, not the principal. And so 5, 10 years later, the amount hasn't really changed too significantly. Well, we can argue that that's a larger social issue that directly impacts a person's life. And that's where we see this intersection between large social issues and personal troubles. We look at the sociological perspective, and the sociological perspective essentially says that we enter every new interaction as a blank canvas. We allow the experience to paint a picture for itself. We enter each new interaction with what we call a beginner's mind. And this beginner's mind allows us to be present in the moment. It allows us to acquire a true understanding about the experience that we're living. This idea that we're challenged as sociologists to suspend our own feelings, our own beliefs, our own thoughts, and we truly immerse ourselves by fully participating in this new reality, in this new social environment. Now, it's a challenge at times for individuals to engage in sociological perspective because we all have our prejudices and our biases. But we have to put on our sociological lenses, and we have to be prepared to do what Aladdin says, to explore a whole new world, and to be open-minded in that exploration. We look at the dominant sociological paradigms, also known as the schools of sociological thought. And the paradigms are structural functionalism and conflict theory, and symbolic interactionism. And we'll define these a little later on. But I do want to make note that structural functionalism and conflict theory both highlight or represent a macro level of analysis. And symbolic interactionism represents a micro level of analysis. And we'll explain that a little later. So what is structural functionalism? Structural functionalism is essentially this idea that we have these interrelated, interconnected components in our society. They interact with one another for the smooth functioning of society. So what does that essentially mean? Well, think of one component as the family. Think about another as the education system. Think about another as the criminal justice system, another as the healthcare system, another as a social welfare system, another as whatever you want to call it. And all these different components that exist are all interconnected in some way. And the idea is that in order to maintain the status quo, in order for society to function smoothly, all of these different components have to operate correctly. That through the socialization process, which we'll define later on in future chapters, families and the education system are responsible for teaching children what are the do's and don'ts of our society. What is appropriate, what is inappropriate behavior? What is acceptable and unacceptable? That both of these components, the family and the education system, are responsible for teaching kids how to follow the rules, for teaching them how to become productive members of our society. And if they successfully accomplish this, well, our society is going to operate smoothly. Now, if they don't successfully accomplish this, then we're going to see dysfunctions in the system. If the family drops the ball, if the education drops the ball, it can have a direct impact on the healthcare system. It can have a direct impact on the criminal justice system. It can have a direct impact on the social welfare system, and so on and so forth. So structural functionalists, they are focused on how do we ensure the success and the smooth functioning of our society. The idea that our society is very complex in nature. And through laws and morals and values and beliefs and customs and so on and so forth, we begin to maintain and govern social life. In addition to that, What we want to take into consideration is that we need to achieve a degree of equilibrium among these different components. And in return, we're going to have social stability. We're going to have continuity. And we start to dig into the concepts of Emil Durkheim. And Emil Durkheim, as you can probably see in the photo, that's a photo of him. Emil Durkheim focused on social bonds that exist within different types of societies. And he said that in simple societies, pre-modern societies, well, they're held together through mechanical solidarity. And in complex modern societies, they're held together through organic solidarity. So what does that mean? Well, when we think about mechanical solidarity, think about the glue that holds society together through shared beliefs, values, and traditions. This is the idea that we have emotional bonds to one another. And these emotional bonds shape our attitudes and our beliefs. These emotional bonds make us committed to one another and make us committed to the idea that we as a group have to survive. That your survival is largely contingent on my ability to perform my assigned tasks. So in pre-modern societies, simple societies, mechanical solidarity, it's this idea that you're going to fetch the water, you're going to raise the kids, you're going to hunt, you're going to protect us, and so on and so forth. And although we may not necessarily agree with the roles that we've been given, we understand that the success and the survival of our tribe or our group is contingent on me being able to perform those duties. There's a sense of communal life here and a personal commitment to one another. And what Durkheim argues is that as time passes, societies transform and societies become more complex. Organic solidarity. This idea that we're no longer held together by emotional bonds, but instead, we're a task-oriented society. We're a society that is interdependent and contingent on, well, what do I need from you? And what do you need from me? This idea that I only need you for as long as I need you. And then I'm going to go my way. And when I need you again, I'm going to come back. We start to see more specialized societies. You're no longer just fetching water or hunting or protecting the community. It's like many organizations. You have position A, B, C. And that's what our society is largely based on. That there's a degree of independence that exists. And once again, as I mentioned before, that we're not necessarily held together in organic solidarity by emotional ties and our commitment to one another. Then we look at this photo to the left, and it's of Merton. And Merton's in deep thought in this photo. And perhaps he's thinking about manifest and latent functions. And manifest functions are the consequences, the intended consequences of an action or behavior. And the latent function are the unintended consequences of an action or behavior. So let's dig into that a little bit. Let's look at the manifest function of going to college. We go and we pursue a college education for the acquisition of knowledge, for preparation for a career, because we hope to apply what we've learned throughout our education to some type of job search process, and we hope to achieve success. Those are the intended consequences of going to college. Now, what are some of the unintended consequences? What are some of the latent functions of going to college? Well, the positives are we're going to meet new people. We're going to be able to network. We're going to be able to participate in extracurricular activities. Right? But in addition to that, think about all the sacrifices you make to pursue a college education. Some of the latent functions are working less hours, spending less time with loved ones and friends, a reduction in our sleep schedules, the stress of doing homework, being able to commit to 4 years or 6 years or 8 years or however long it takes for us to complete our education. That can be a very taxing and exhausting process that we may not necessarily always consider as some of the unintended consequences of going to college. What we also want to take into consideration is this paradigm of conflict theory. This idea that Our society is in constant battle for limited or scarce resources, such as money, power, prestige, authority. And Karl Marx is the godfather of conflict theory. And Karl Marx talks about this concept. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, that's Karl Marx. You probably recognize him from some of your history books. But he talks about this concept of social inequality, that there's an unequal distribution of wealth and power and prestige among the members of our society. And because of this conflict that exists, because of this unequal distribution, it creates conflict, and it's inevitable that there's going to be coercion. There's going to be dominance of some kind. And Karl Marx looks at this and says, there are some winners and there are some losers within our society. And he calls the winners the bourgeoisie, the business owners, and that there's this constant battle against the proletariat, the workers. And if you look at the right-hand side, Karl Marx is essentially arguing in this illustration that the bourgeoisie, the person on the left, the person on the right, is trying to squeeze every single ounce of labor out of the worker and trying to give that person the least amount of compensation. And so Karl Marx argues that there's a constant battle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and that the proletariat experiences what he calls alienation. This idea that there's no connection to the products that the proletariat are creating. I want you to think about it from this perspective. Perhaps you produce a desk, and you, as the sole carpenter of that desk, you produce the desk and it costs you $50 to make between the materials and the labor. And then you sell that desk for $500, meaning that you essentially made a $450 profit that you can reinvest into your business, that you can reinvest into your family to cover the necessities of life. Well, what Karl Marx says is that according to alienation, it still costs $50 to produce that desk. But instead of making a $450 profit, that goes automatically to the bourgeoisie, and you receive the exact same wage, regardless of how many desks you produce. You can produce 10 desks, and that $4,500 profit that's made off those 10 desks, well, you don't see any of it because your wage doesn't change. In fact, the bourgeoisie is going to demand more from you. Today, they want 10 desks. Tomorrow, they want 15. The next day, they want 20 desks. And they want to pay you the least amount of money possible and maximize your labor to increase their profitability. And so we look at this, and then we go a step further. Karl Marx says that the bourgeoisie maintain control of our society. So it's really their ideologies that are forced upon us, that their ideologies begin to shape our beliefs and value system. And he calls this a false consciousness, this idea that the oppressed, the proletariat, failed to acknowledge that the ideology of the ruling class is embedded in our dominant ideology in our everyday society. This idea that we have this carrot that dangles in front of our nose and we have these blinders on the side. And we're constantly chasing that carrot, and occasionally we'll get a little bite, and then the carrots move further and further away, and we're completely neglecting everything and anything that's occurring around us. And then we look at this concept of class consciousness. And a class consciousness is a state of being woke, a state of being aware. This idea that we become aware that we're being exploited, that we understand that we're being oppressed, and we're going to do something about it, that we are going to challenge the status quo and the way business is conducted within our society. And then we cross over to symbolic interactionism, and symbolic interactionisms on a face-to-face level, on an individual level. This idea that we derive meaning from our language and from symbols that are around us. This idea that humans interact with things that are based on meanings ascribed to those things. That the ascribed meanings of those things come from our interactions with others in society. And the meaning of things is interpreted by a person when dealing with things in specific circumstances, which means that our life experience largely shapes how we interpret language. Our life experience largely shapes how we interact with symbols in our society. that we have to develop this cultural knowledge in regards to symbols. This idea that we have scripts that we follow at times within our everyday lives that help govern how we behave, how we interpret, how we converse with others. And we think symbols, and we think about the representation of symbols and how those can carry very complex meanings. And so we're going to see some symbols right now. On the left-hand side, we have the Uber sign. 15 years ago, would you have known what that is? How about the Instagram sign? How about the Golden Arches? How about the Chili's sign? How about Twitter? How about YouTube? How about USC? Spot on. Chuck E. Cheese. I want you to think about it, how symbols carry with them multiple meanings. McDonald's for some of us might mean a McFlurry, chicken McNuggets, a Big Mac. For others, they may interpret it as obesity. People may look at social media accounts such as YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and think, wow, what a brilliant way to connect with the social world, to stay in contact with loved ones and friends in real time. For other individuals, it may represent addiction. It may represent a source of lower self-esteem. We can call this a reference group where we compare ourselves to what we see in social media. So we want to understand that symbols carry with them an incredible meaning, but at the same time, they can have a double meaning depending on who's doing the interpretation. And so it's very important to understand our life experiences, to understand history, to understand there are multiple meanings before we interpret an object. For example, the Nazi symbol, the swastika. The swastika is tied to Hindu. The swastika is tied to Buddhism. Now, the Nazis essentially hijacked the swastika from both Hinduism and Buddhism. They tilted it, and they let it stand for fascism, for extermination of people, for intolerance, for discrimination. When in Hinduism and Buddhism, it means self-reflection and betterment. The swastika didn't come around when the Nazis came about. The swastika was around many, many years prior. And so we want to take that into consideration when we're interpreting symbols. Thank you for your time.